What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with 444, and we are talking players to cut for week 15. It is playoff time, and while you might think that your fantasy team is set and ready for a championship push, there's always little tweaks that you can make to optimize your roster. Before we get started, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you want more fantasy insights and tips, head over to 444.com/plans and sign up for a subscription today. And exclusively for our YouTube audience, use promo code YouTube at checkout to save 25%. Now let's go ahead and dive right in. First player. We're going to kick this off spicy this week. You're not going to like this one, but you can cut Khalil Herbert. Herbert is the highest rostered Chicago running back, which is wild to me because he hasn't played more than 50% of snaps since week 5. To be fair, there was obviously the IR stint in that giant gap, but since his return, Herbert's snap counts have been as follows. Week 11, 43% of snaps with 16 carries for 35 yards and 2 receptions for 6 yards for 6.1 fantasy points. That's not good, and it's a little bit misleading. In that game, Donta Foreman operated as the lead back until he left with an injury earlier in the game. Week 12, 21% of snaps with 6 carries for 24 yards and 2 receptions for 14 yards for 5.8 fantasy points. In that game, Roschon Johnson significantly outperformed him with 74% of snaps, dominating the carries and receiving work. After the bye week, week 14, 17% of snaps with 3 carries for 8 yards for 0.8 fantasy points. Foreman returned and was once again the clear lead back. Johnson also outsnapped him as well because of his third down work. He doesn't get the early down work. He can't get third down work. He's not the goal line back. And if one of the backs goes down, it doesn't really matter because there's another back that will outsnap him and outplay him. What exactly is the benefit of rostering Khalil Herbert? There are actually high value handcuffs on waivers that you could add for guys like Khalil Herbert, guys that should be on your roster like Rico Dowdle, Tajay Spears, and even Chase Brown. I would roster all of those guys for the upside that they offer if the lead back goes down before I would roster Khalil Herbert. Moving on to the next player, Josh Dobbs. The Josh Dobbs Cinderella story from 2023 was truly wonderful, but it appears the clock has struck midnight. Dobbs has been up and down in terms of passing and generally been a low volume quarterback. He's lived by his rushing upside. It was great for fantasy, not particularly great for winning games, and that was fine in Arizona because Arizona was fully aware they weren't a competitive team. But Minnesota pulled the plug on Dobbs in week 14 after 2 straight losses and shockingly bad performances. In week 12, Dobbs had 22 completions for 185 yards and 1 touchdown and 4 interceptions. 4 interceptions. Minnesota had a bye week and they gave Dobbs one more chance, and the result was even worse. 10 completions on 23 attempts for 63 yards before they pulled him from the game for Nick Mullins. It's not as if we haven't seen bad performances from Dobbs earlier in the season, but Minnesota is competing for a spot in the playoffs. They cannot afford erratic and inconsistent play. It's a shame because this week's matchup against Cincinnati, excellent. I would have definitely started him in that. But if I can't trust you to be the starter for the entire game, how can we have any confidence starting you at all? He's not the starter. If we can't start you at any point, can we really roster you? No. You can cut him. Moving on to the next player, Jerry Jeudy. We have talked about Jerry Jeudy a few weeks ago, but it has to be said, there is no point in rostering Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy is well over 50% rostered in fantasy leagues and hasn't exceeded 13 fantasy points this entire season. That is his ceiling, 13 fantasy points. I can throw an imaginary rock at waivers and hit 10 guys that could give you 13 fantasy points in a good matchup. Jerry Jeudy is wide receiver 56 in PPR, averaging a paltry 8.2 fantasy points per game. He is wide receiver 62 in PPR average points per game. When you consider that he didn't have any injuries that forced him out of a game early, that tilted his average, there is no way you can manipulate the stats here to say anything other than the fact that Jerry Jeudy simply isn't a viable option in any fantasy format. There's just no way to spin this to make him a viable start or even worthy of a roster. You can also drop Derek Carr. I don't have a ton of negative stats around Derek Carr because in games where he's been healthy, he's been a decent streaming option. Decent, not spectacular, No massive upside, but he'll get you between 16 to 19 fantasy points, and that's fine. But you can get similar production from streaming lower rostered options that you can find on waivers. So unless you're in a extremely deep league and starting Carr is your only option, you don't really need to roster Carr. If you have another start or a fringe QB1 and Carr is just sitting on your bench as an insurance policy, it's a bad policy. It's time to ditch the policy and upgrade to someone that you can actually cash it on. Go grab a handcuff. Multiple running backs go down every single week. Having a handcuff on your bench is a true advantage. You can drop Carr to make room for something that you can actually use. A couple other players from last week's video that are repeat candidates this week. We won't deep dive into it because the reasoning is exactly the same as last week. You can move on from Josh Downs and Jahan Dotson. Dotson was on a bye week, so nothing really changed here. He's still unreliable, low volume, and we just want more, but we can't really get that in Washington's offense. And Josh Downs just continues to underwhelm. Weeks 5 through 8, Downs averaged 16.6 fantasy points per game in PPR, making him wide receiver 13 over that span. It was all an illusion. After week 8, Downs suffered an injury, and since then, he hasn't reached double-digit fantasy points. The pass game runs through Michael Pittman. It's not going to change. You can cut him. That wraps things up. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like the video and comment below as well. And if you want more fantasy insights and tips, head over to 444.com/plans and sign up for a subscription today. And exclusively for our YouTube audience, use promo code YouTube at checkout to save 25%.